1865 marked the end of a brutal 4-year civil war. With the fighting over, millions of enslaved Black Americans finally had their freedom recognized by the United States government. The government formalized this shift by adding the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. This was the largest single change to the nation's legal framework since its founding. On paper, this text represented an enormous victory. After more than 2 centuries of legalized generational captivity, the highest law in the land stated that chattel slavery was abolished. But the end of the war did not change the minds of the former Confederate planters. They had built their entire economic empire on unpaid labor, and they were determined to keep their wealth and their position at the top of the social hierarchy. Rather than adapt to a free labor market, those in power began looking for ways to rewrite the rules to their advantage. Southern leaders constructed 3 distinct, interlocking systems designed to bypass the Constitution. Together, these traps successfully forced thousands of free Black citizens right back into the fields and factories they had just escaped. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the federal government reversed early efforts to distribute land to newly freed citizens. Without property or equipment of their own, many Black families had to find work on the exact same plantations they had previously been confined to. This dynamic created a system called sharecropping. Sharecropping is an agricultural arrangement where workers farm a piece of land, and instead of receiving a cash wage, they are paid with a portion of the crops they harvest. The catch was entirely in the logistics. Because the workers had no starting capital, the white landowners required them to buy all their seeds, farming tools, and even daily food on credit from a local store owned by that same landlord, often at steep interest rates. At harvest, landowners dictated cotton prices, calculating the crushing weight of accumulated debt to outweigh the workers' crop share. With the math rigged, workers ended the season owing money. The balance rolled over, legally tying them to the land to pay an ever-growing deficit. Whole families, across multiple generations, spent decades performing the exact same exhaustive manual labor they did prior to emancipation. The agricultural economy of the post-war South relied on this manipulation. Sharecropping operated as a mathematical trap designed to replicate the conditions of slavery through inescapable debt. If the economics of sharecropping were so heavily stacked against the worker, the logical solution would be to pack up and leave town to find a fair wage. Southern politicians anticipated this exact move. In response, they passed a series of strict regulations known as Black Codes. These were restrictive laws explicitly designed to govern the behavior and limit the movement of free Black Americans. The sharpest tools within these codes were vagrancy laws. These statutes categorized normal behaviors, like loitering or breaking curfew, or simply being unemployed, as criminal acts. In practice, local police demanded that Black citizens carry a physical labor contract at all times. If a person was found walking down the street without written proof of employment, they could be immediately arrested. A person who had legally secured their freedom could walk outside to look for a better job, only to be stopped by a sheriff and find themselves violently locked in a county cell before sundown. The Black Codes successfully weaponized the justice system, making the simple act of existing without a white boss an actionable criminal offense. Once a citizen was processed into the prison system under a vagrancy charge, the local government utilized a specific clause written directly into the Constitution. The text of the 13th Amendment legally abolished slavery and involuntary servitude across the United States, but it included a massive loophole in the very first sentence. It permitted slavery except as a punishment for crime. State governments exploited this exact phrasing to build the convict lease system. Prisons rented out their incarcerated populations to private companies, providing those businesses with incredibly cheap, forced labor. Men swept up by the Black Codes were stripped of their autonomy, bound in chains, and forced to live in unhygienic, brutal labor camps. Massive American corporations, including regional railroads, logging operations, and steel companies, aggressively utilized this leased labor, sending men into dark coal mines for zero pay. By combining targeted arrests with a constitutional loophole, states maintained a continuous pipeline of free labor, routing legally free citizens right back into the grueling captivity they had technically been liberated from. These 3 mechanisms of control were not a brief historical hiccup. This network of debt, selective policing, and forced labor dominated the American South from the end of the Civil War all the way up to the Second World War. Entire generations of Black Americans lived and died within this engineered system. They were methodically blocked from accumulating property, passing down wealth, or exercising the rights granted to them by the federal government. The promise of the new legal framework was effectively smothered by footnotes, caveats, and heavy localized enforcement. The history of the post-war South demonstrates that declaring a right on paper does not automatically make it a reality on the ground. A functioning society requires constant maintenance. It demands close attention to how laws are actually applied in practice, and a willingness to step in when those in power try to use fine print to pull everyone backward.